Is global warming real? Is climate change irreversible? Why are carbon emissions still rising? Join host Dr. Alberto Troccoli, a global leader in climate science and its application to the energy sector, as he unpacks these pressing issues. Through candid conversations with leading experts, get ready to demystify climate change and explore its many layers. So, let's Climunicate!
Hello and welcome to this episode of Let's Climunicate. I'm delighted to be here with Professor Robert Mendelsohn from the University of Yale. He's an expert in environmental economics, and I'm excited to be talking with Robert about some of the pressing issues around climate change and what society can do to tackle it. So welcome, Robert.
I'm delighted to be on this show. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Excellent. So we'll start by asking you a bit of your background. I know you were passionate about specifically climate adaptation. You worked at Yale with some of your eminent colleagues at your level. So it'd be good to hear more about how you got to this climate adaptation interest.
Well, I guess this coming back from trying to a field. I've been trying to study the field of measuring environmental benefits in general. That is, to quantifying environmental benefits. So I've been doing that since I went to the PhD program. And then one of the things that I've gotten involved in the last 30 years is climate change. So I should have gotten involved in it probably a lot longer ago, because when I was first studying under Bressner Nordhaus, he was suddenly studying this question about CO2. And I said, well, what's all this fuss about carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide is relatively harmless. And I just completely missed the boat. But that, it's a common mistake for a PhD student not to have any perspective on life. But 20 years later, after studying many things about the environment, I did come back to climate change. And by that time, it was the science behind climate change was much clearer. It was very clear at that point that you put CO2 in the atmosphere, you're going to warm the planet. And warming the planet was going to introduce all sorts of new things that we've never seen before. And so it just opened up an entire world of research. And so about 30 years ago, I guess, I started studying the impacts of climate change. And one of the things that I realized is in the field itself, everybody assumed that nothing would change, just the climate. So they were imagining at that time, an economy in 1995 or something, and it would still look exactly like that in 100 years from now, except that suddenly we'd have a warmer world. And it occurred to me that's actually probably not the way it's going to be. One thing is the economy's not going to stay still. It's going to change. But it's also true that we're going to learn something about the climate warming. We're going to learn as we go along, and we'll make adjustments. And so I've been very curious about what adjustments will we actually make, and does it make any difference if we make adjustments? So that's what adaptation is all about.
So to clarify, you mentioned also William Nordhaus, and I didn't realize he was your PhD advisor, and yes. apart from being your collaborator, so you've been collaborating with him for many years, I guess, no?
Many years, yes, you can say since 1978.
Excellent, yes. And for our listeners who don't know, William Nordhaus is a Nobel Prize winner for economics a few years ago on climate change issues.
Yes. He won the prize, I think, largely because of all his contributions to the climate change debate.
Because here at our podcast, we talk with people from different backgrounds, specialists in their fields, but with views around climate change that varies quite a bit, because we think that there needs to be close communication amongst everybody, not just like-minded. And in order to do that, I think it helps to have a bit of framing, and that's why we have set up this 4 quick fire questions I would like to put to you, Robert. So the first one is, it's not a test. You just give me, just a rough estimate or nothing if you don't want to answer. The first question is how much the global air temperature has changed over the past 150 years, say. That's the reference, normal reference.
150. So it's about 1.3 degrees, something like that. if you go
Excellent.
back far enough. The further back you go, the more it's warm because it was cold before we had climate change.
Right. Yes. But that's you just want looking for like a ballpark figure. That's excellent. And would you know of this 1.3 degree that you mentioned? How much of this is due to man-made emissions?
I would say most of it, maybe a full degree, is due to man-made emissions.
Great. And so, looking at the future now, what do you expect based on the knowledge we have? The temperature is going to be by the end of the century. How much?
That's definitely much more uncertain than looking back in the past, because there's a lot of things that have to happen before that unfolds. One thing we don't know is how much mitigation we're going to do. But I'd say the rough guess, I'm expecting it could easily be 2 degrees warmer 100 years from now than it is today.
And the last question. Yes, of course. Yeah. And the last question is about, this is a bit more complex, but it's just to get the sense of where, what you know about this, what's so-called tipping points. So, this is a tipping point from a physical perspective, climate science perspective, like, the high sheets or the methane thawing, the thermal highline circulation. These are all processes. There are around 10 tipping points or fewer that are being highlighted as being perhaps very low risk, but high impact. So what do you think is going to be the probability of one such tipping point to be triggered by the end of the century?
Well, there's myriads of tipping points in natural fields. So this is a very difficult question to answer because of the complexity of it. But there's no question that there's a lot of nonlinearity in the system. And you were talking about physical science tipping points, but there's also on the impact side. We're pretty convinced that temperature has kind of a hill-shaped effect on most sectors of the economy. And when you go up a hill and you start going down, that's most people's definition of what a tipping point is. And so we're going to be going through a continuous process of tipping points. Because in many ways, if you look across the planet, there are already people who are in areas that are way too warm. That the temperature is actually already clearly harmful relative to being at a temperate, optimal temperate climate. And so for those people, the tipping points probably happened hundreds of years ago. But as the climate warms, that tipping point is going to gradually move ever further north. And rather than everybody benefiting, you're going to rise to the top of that hill. You're going to be at the top for a while and you'll be happy up there. But then you're going to start coming back down the other side of that hill. So that's going to happen all over the planet. And it's going to be a gradual evolving process.
Indeed, yes, there are many tipping points. And I think the question is, it was not meant to get a straight answer or a definitive answer. It's just to get a sense of, the risks are there. How do we tackle the risks? Which is something that we are going to explore more during the discussion. Now we get into the more interesting parts of your expertise, the economic side, how we can tackle these challenges around climate change without breaking the wallet, basically. So that's what we are trying to do and find out with you, because we talk about net zero. I'm referring also to one of the podcasts you were invited to give your interview, and it was very interesting. You touched on mitigation, adaptation, various aspects, and it was nearly 3 years ago, but I'd like to explore some of the same points, but perhaps in a different lights, also given that what we learned in the past 3 years, and lessons from COVID, the lessons from other crises like the Ukraine war, and so on, and so how we tackle big issues as a global community at the world level, given some of the challenges that we are facing. So the first question is simply the standard one. Let's start with the standard one, like net zero by 2050. That's a dream pipe, is it?
Well, from the mitigation perspective, it's a dream pipe in the sense that we still don't agree with each other as a world. All the power in the world lies in nation states, and the nation states have not surrendered their power to try to solve a global problem. So the first and foremost reason we're not making much progress in this is we're just not cooperating yet in finding that cooperative solution, putting resources into a cooperative solution. So the fact that we're barely starting means 2050. We should have started on 2050, thinking about 2050 30 years ago. And the fact that we've made so little progress in 30 years, it makes the chances of making dramatic progress in the next 30 years very remote. But that's entirely on the political side. That's just that we don't have a global government. We don't have the mechanism to actually get to something where you're going to be spending tens of trillions of dollars on a project that there's clearly no agreement that it's worth doing. So that's the political side of this. But then there's the economic side, and it turns out it's just super expensive to try to get to net zero that fast. You have to really throw away lots of very valuable equipment, give up lots of opportunities, and it's a huge sacrifice. And it's not that we can't make huge sacrifices. I think it was actually useful to talk about the pandemic because that was a place where we were willing to make some pretty big sacrifices. And similarly, if the war in Ukraine suddenly expanded and it was a war in Europe, Europe would go to great lengths to protect itself. So there are urgent things that we will, in fact, make huge sacrifices for. The problem with climate change is it's a distant, vague problem in most people's minds. You say, well, it could be terrible in 2100, or maybe it's going to be really bad in 2500. I mean, it's just, that is so far away in the distant future. It doesn't have the urgency that gets people to say, well, I'll make a huge sacrifice for that today. So that's the economic problem for going after 2050, net zero in 2050. Net zero in 2100, that's a little more realistic. Net zero in 2150, yes, definitely, we should be able to do that. So part of this question is net zero when? So what does net zero mean? Net zero is basically identifying an equilibrium temperature that is going to be our maximum temperature that we're going to live with. And the sooner you hit it, the lower the temperature is going to be. But the earlier you try to do it, the more difficult it's going to be because you don't have any time to prepare yourself and to get organized. So by delaying net zero, by accepting slightly higher temperatures, we're giving ourselves time to get organized, to do mitigation carefully and thoroughly. So I'm an advocate for net zero, but definitely not 2050. I think that's an example where the perfect is the enemy of the good. It's a wonderful idea, but if that's the only thing that's acceptable, most people will say, well, forget it then. This is way too difficult. I'm going to just give up on this entirely.
So you packed a lot on your answer, which is great. I mean,
that wasn't a short answer. I apologize.
No. It was great. It was great. But there is so much information which I would like to unpack a little bit because, this is obviously a very complex problem. We're not going to tackle it in its entirety. But to me, some of the key issues on tackling the net zero is. First is the fact that it's good to have a target. It may be not correct to place it at 2050, but I would like to hear from you what it would be also as a social scientist, economist, how is this perceived by people if you say, 2050 is not achievable, let's delay it. And so, we don't do much because we have time. When we know, for example, that energy systems, which are, the critical pillar of this mitigation, have a time replacement time, which is very long. It's decades because of it's the same for forests. If we want to do mitigation through forests, growing forests, it takes decades. So the point is that we need to start now in order to see the effects in 20, 30 years. And if we say, okay, 2050 is not achievable, let's do 2100, people say, okay, we have a 10, 20 more years to start. And so we keep delaying. So how do you address this issue?
Well, okay, so then the one question is the target. What's your temperature target? Another question is, when do you start? I think you start now. So I am not into delay. My sense is, no, you got to begin. But the question is how much can you achieve immediately? And my sense is, if you say the way to begin is, hey, we're going to do a marathon and we're going to start by sprinting. You might begin really fast, but I don't think you're going to get further than 100 or 200 yards and you're going to be done. And that'll be the end of the program. The idea is the long-term planning is super important. And I agree with you about the target is super important. But having a long-term target doesn't mean that you don't do things immediately. And I think that the problem we're facing today is we've picked a stringent target and no thing to do immediately. No immediate goals. Nothing we have to do. No mandatory things that have to be put in place right away. And that's problematic. What you want to do is decide to go pick your long run target and then figure out, well, what does that mean I should be doing immediately? And what economics tells you is it's actually very helpful to start with the least expensive things to do. That is, look at all the mitigation things you can do. Let's do the least expensive ones first. And as we use up all our low cost mitigation choices, then gradually move to more and more expensive things. So the idea is that even if you say, look, 2100 is the place where we're going to get to net zero, that still means you should have a non-zero carbon price today, or you should have some kind of restricted trading regime as you have in Europe about what your aggregate amount of emissions should be this decade immediately. So the problem we're facing today is we just haven't made that mandatory. We haven't connected doing mitigation today with the target. And I think that's super important. Your point is, just because we have a long distance target doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing anything. It means we should actually be doing something right away. But the question is, can it be reasonably modest so that we all can agree that we're going to do it? And that's where I think the current policies are deeply flawed. They've picked such aggressive targets that really what they mean is you have to do something incredibly expensive today. And nobody's willing to do something very expensive today, or very few people are. Europe's trying to lead the way, but nobody's following. Everybody else Europe's up there at $70, $80 a ton for carbon. The rest of the world is saying, well, $10, maybe not. Maybe for a small few things, I'll do $10. They're dilly-dallying with almost zero. And the point is, we actually need something. Well, no, actually, we're all going to do $10. And everyone's going to do it. No one's going to escape from this. It's going to be $10 for everybody. And when we're done with all the $10 mitigation, we're going to move it up to $20. And then we're going to move it to $30. And we're going to gradually tighten the regulations, encouraging more and more mitigation as time goes on to get to that target. So the thing is that future target has to be connected back to an action today that people will actually take, not just talk about. They'll take it. We won't just have a meeting that said, we'll do this in 50 years. We'll do this now. So we need more things that we're doing now. And the way to get the world to do things now is to say, well, what can the world afford to do now? And to start with whatever that is. And I think it's something that's much more modest than 2050, what you'd have to do to get to net zero by 2050.
So I'm well into marathon. I really like marathons. I do them myself. So I really appreciate this approach of taking things slowly and not rushing. The thing is that, again, when you talk to someone about taking things slowly versus rushing, I think it's also good to have some metrics. I can see that the metric of the carbon price is a very good one, but other metrics are also useful to refer to, which are, for example, in the last 20 years, renewable energy has increased by 10% in terms of electricity. Now electricity globally is around 30% from renewables, and wind and solar are growing very fast, particularly solar power. And this is without so much effort in terms of, the economic incentive of the carbon price. And you see also, China is investing about half of the funding for new installation is coming from China. So, and this is again, without any carbon price. China doesn't have a carbon price, it's mandated. And this triggers all the economy, it's, then the production is the learning by doing, is the innovation that comes through all this. If you look at cost, McKinsey estimated that it's about the cost of reaching net zero is about 8 trillion a year, or roughly, up to 2050. But at the same time, referring back to what was asking before about the tipping point, there is a study by Deloitte saying that there could be a 7% decrease in GDP by 2070 due to climate change. And, we're already seeing things happening that may or may not be related to climate change, like forest fires or flooding and so on. The very fact that we don't know for certain whether they are related to climate change or not, this is already something big, because we should be worried about, whether what about this is, if this was linked to climate change, and more of this will come because the temperature is increasing. So I'd like to, and like you've done in your studies, you mentioned before, the curve that relates GDP to temperature increase is linear or close to linear, whereas there could be tipping points there as well. So I know it's a huge problem, but how can we try to tell the global population that, yes, it's okay to go slow, but what does it really mean to go slow to achieve the target?
Well, that's a great question. You were talking about how renewable energy is prospering, and it's doing it without a carbon price, but it's been doing it by mandate. That is, it's not that the governments haven't forced it. The governments have forced the renewable energy, and Europe has put more money into renewable energy than it has into other things. One of the things that you find out is that, well, there's actually a myriad of mitigation techniques you actually need to invest in. And one of the problems with the approach you're mentioning is we tend to get fixated on one of them, as if one of them alone is going to take us all the way over the finish line. And it looks like that there really isn't a technology like that. It looks like we're going to need many different kinds of technology, many different kinds of ways of improving the situation. And the problem with doing it one at a time is governments tend to focus on one thing at a time because it's simple for them. And so right now, for example, Europe has done, if you'll excuse me, too much renewable energy. Not in the sense that renewable energy is bad, but in the sense that they've put too much of their eggs into that single basket. And what they needed to do is spread that out more across other types of ways of controlling things. And in Europe's not alone. Europe's, in fact, the best region in the world in terms of actually making a difference on climate change. One of the things that the United States has done a little poorly and China's done very poorly is we might have invested in renewable energy, but we did nothing to stop burning coal. And it turns out that if you don't stop burning coal, you don't really make much progress towards mitigation. You can't just say, well, here's all this wonderful clean energy, have fun, use lots of energy, but not reduce your coal. The whole purpose of doing the renewable energy was it was supposed to replace coal. And in Europe, you've done a little bit of trying to get rid of a lot of your coal. That is, you've done a lot, actually, to get rid of coal in Europe. But in the rest of the world, that has not happened. We've got renewable energy and we've got coal. And so it turns out that that's less effective than if we had said, okay, the renewable energy part's fine, but let's put more eggs now in the other baskets. Let's do some more on energy conservation, let the price of energy go up so that people are more careful with energy. Let's get rid of more coal. Let's move towards fossil fuels that have less carbon in them. Let's do other kinds of technologies that are going to be part of the overall solution, which could be things like putting carbon into forests and other activities, which are all going to help. These are all activities that are going to be part of the mitigation game. So the reason why economists keep pushing for the carbon price is it forces you to spread out your eggs across many more baskets. And you're going to take advantage of low cost activities in other sectors that are being overlooked right at the moment. And the reason that's attractive is that you'll get the same outcome you want at the end, but you'll spend less money getting there. And that is something which, because this is going to be super expensive, doing this a little bit more carefully so that we don't waste a lot of money, it's important. Because you run a bad transportation network or something, you spend $5 billion poorly, but you run a bad mitigation problem, you're going to spend $5 trillion poorly. I mean, the scale of the mistakes you can make with mitigation are enormous. So it's really important that we do this carefully so that we're not wasting money. That doesn't mean that it has to be super slow. The reason it has to be slow is it's a question of what's the sacrifice people are willing to make right now for climate change. And you kind of teased at that before. If suddenly the climate was very obviously very harmful, that would create incentives that people will say, whoa, okay, this is serious. I've got to do something about this. We can't tolerate how much warmer it's getting, and they'll make bigger sacrifices. So I think the problem is the people who are very excited about climate mitigation are perhaps too excited, and the rest of the world hasn't caught up with them. And it's one thing for 5% of the people to say, let's spend a lot of money. But if the other 95% don't get it, you just can't get very far. So we need, the reason we're going slower is you've got to get more people to be part of this program. It can't just be the excited 5% saying, yeah, I'll spend 5% of my income. This is great. I love this. The rest of the people are saying, well, I don't know if I'll spend more than $100. I mean, you've got to get everybody on board. And that's not happened yet. That's the problem. It's not happened because the 2050 program is so expensive. Nobody's on board. Nobody's willing to buy that because it's just too expensive. The slow program, it turns out that might be something that's affordable, and you might be able to get everybody on board. And I think it's super important that we get everybody on board. We have mandatory programs that actually happen globally, and we worry about doing the least cost things first. And we make this thing happen. So that's where I am. I'm into making this happen, but I think we have to be realistic about it.
No, I agree with you that, there is the early adopters, like in any technology, people who buy the first iPhone or the Mac as soon as they come. And it's normally, it's actually, there is an estimate which is around 5% when you go to up the S curve. And when you go over the 5%, then you start to get in the cascading effect, And so
right.
It may be that we are there because, I can see that 2050 is probably too soon. But also when we say slow program, I don't see a well laid out program. So in my view is when we say slow program, again, like I said before, people perceive this as, okay, let's delay things because we're never going to be able to have a perfect program. We're going to make mistakes, but as a matter of fact, again, I'm not supporting, but I'm looking the renewable energy particularly. But I mean, I do in practice because I see it as a good solution. But there are other solutions, like you say. But in practice, the cost reduction in solar power has been amazing in the last 10 years, and we can't disregard that, whether it was subsidized or not. And in fact, as a matter of fact, even now we still have maybe 8-to-1 ratio between subsidies to fossil fuel globally to renewable energy. So 8 times more for fossil fuel than renewable energy, as worked out by the International Energy Agency. So it's, there's this imbalance. Although people say, there's been a huge investment in renewables and huge subsidies, there is still a lot on fossil fuel. And I think the crux of the matter is what you mentioned a few times, this fact that people perceive this as a very distant risk. And the problem is that, unfortunately, in the last 20 years, we've seen the global temperature increasing. And the problem is, the main problem is the climate system is actually a very complex system with a very high inertia. Particularly the oceans are the flywheel of the climate. And once you put it in motion, it can't stop it, for decades. And I think this is what is missing. I think as climate scientists, we wish we are wrong. We wish that temperature won't rise in the next 10 years. But what if it rises? And then, there's no way to stop it because you set in motion this flywheel.
Yes, no, there's no question about that. The science part of this. You and I are not debating the science part of this. We're in agreement about it. That if you're putting more and more CO2 in the atmosphere, GHGs in general, you're going to warm the planet, and that process isn't going to stop as long as we keep putting more and more GHGs up there. So that part's very clear. What we're talking about right now is, well, just how quickly do we reduce those GHGs? My sense is the question is, what's a practical way to do it? So one practical way is just screech and say, oh, stop everything, come to an immediate stop. But it turns out that's incredibly painful. There's just no way that you can sell that to people. They're just not going to buy it. Or to put it another way, you could try it, but I would bet that your government, or whatever government you're part of, Australia or Italy or all of Europe, that the second you do that, you're going to suddenly realize that you're being voted out of office. That it's the people are not going to put up with it. You already see that pushback in Europe when they've tried to impose costs that are going to be, the households can recognize. That they're saying, wait a second, this is way too fast. That's a super expensive. We mean I can't have a gas furnace. There's all sorts of things they're saying, you're going too fast. This is costing too much. I'm not willing to spend this. It's important to be realistic about what people can afford to do. And I agree with you that if things got terrible outside, if you suddenly woke up the next day and the world was just going to pieces because it was a little bit warmer, that you'd start to get the incentive to spend that kind of money. Just like we did when we got the pandemic. There was a huge scare and people were very frightened. Millions of people died. That got a lot of energy immediately. And the world did something about that very quickly. That isn't happening with climate change. What's happening in my mind is people are taking the weather, which is, the weather is going to happen anyway. And they're talking about all these things that happen because of the weather. But the weather isn't climate change. The fact that we have hurricanes and that you have thunderstorms and snowstorms and that there's hot days in the summer. I mean, those are just parts of the existing climate. That trying to make the weather seem scary isn't a great way to get people to invest in climate change. Because I think it's telling them a lie in many ways. It's telling them that if you only spent money on this, you wouldn't have weather anymore. But we're going to always have weather. And what we want to see now is, well, okay, this temperature change that you're seeing, what is that doing? And how bad is that? And this is actually what I've been really curious about. Because I first got into doing climate change, I was thinking, this has got to be super bad. We're changing the temperature of the planet. This has got to be really bad for us. Let's see what would actually happen. Well, will we not be able to grow any crops? Will all our crops wither and die? When we started to look at this really carefully, we realized actually that isn't going to be true. The global food supply is not actually being threatened by the kinds of temperature change we're talking about having over the next 100 years. The global food supply is going to be ample for the global population over that time period. So we have space. There's room for the temperatures to warm. There's space there that we could still live in. And it's not as urgent as some people are saying. It's not that if we go from 1.3 degrees to 1.4, the world is coming to an end. As far as I can tell, we can go easily up to 2 degrees and we'll hardly notice what the damages are. It's only when you get past 2 degrees that you'll start to see, whoa, okay, there are some damages out here. The question is, are they enough to make deep sacrifices? And that's the balancing game that I think we're not playing very well. We're not balancing how harmful is this against what does it cost to stop it. And we're not balancing that well. And because we're not balancing it well, the activists are saying we should do this a dramatic thing, and most of the people are saying, well, why should we do anything at all? There's a big gap between those. And my sense is we need to address that, to calm down a little bit on the mitigation side, be realistic about the impact side, and recognize, well, maybe the impacts over the next 50 years are really not that serious. But as it gets warmer and warmer, those impacts are going to get much more serious. And because of the flywheel that you were describing, because you're putting in motion future warming today, you have to think ahead. You have to start to realize, oh, what about that temperature that's 2 degrees warmer than today? How bad is that? And is that something that, well, okay, we can accept 3 degrees, but I don't want to go beyond 3 degrees. Well, that's when you're starting to talk about realistic targets, that actually the costs start to come down dramatically because you're talking about net zero in 2100 now. And yet the damages are being held under control. And that's the balance I think we need to be a little more realistic about. Because if we can be realistic about our goal, then we can move back to, well, what we'll be doing in 2025 if that's our goal in 2100. Well, we should have something like a $20 carbon tax globally that's actually mandated, that everybody's using. Not that we're pretending to use or we will use in 2050, that we use now, that we actually do that mitigation now. And that will have a path of increasing prices as we approach 2100 that'll get us to net zero by 2100. That there is a path like that. There is a more moderate program that I think you can get the whole world on board. And for a long time we said, oh, well, the US and the EU will do it, and the rest of the world catch up sometime. But it turns out that mitigation's entirely up to the rest of the world. The EU and the US together are going to make up something like 25-30% of the emissions. 70%, 80% of the emissions are going to come from the rest of the world. They have to be on board. We have to come up with mitigation plans that the whole world will adopt. Otherwise, we're wasting our money. And so that's what I'm concerned about. I think we need more moderate things, but we need them to be mandatory. We need to actually be serious about doing something now, but be realistic about what's realistic to do now, and then start.
I agree with you about the being moderate and taking things in a ponderate way and plan things accordingly. But the crux of the matter is, again, like you highlighted, is this issue around the effect of temperature change, which is, you mentioned the weather, but I mean, what the climate community is showing is that the weather is also changing because the background temperature is changing and other things as well. So it's really around that issue of what is acceptable for us. I mean,
Yes.
the globe doesn't mind. The planet, if you warm it 4 degrees, it can survive. It's us, having more events like storms, and they have happened all the time. The question is now we are seeing, because of this increasing temperature, there is much more dynamics in the system, in the climate system, and this is leading to more severe events, which, like I mentioned before, some of them are relatable. They are, attributable to climate change. So it's all around this perception of increased temperature, risk, and if we say, okay, if the scientific community finds that 3 degrees doesn't make any change to events, that's fine. But I think the message is slightly different, that these extreme events are increasing. And that's why some people are suggesting a not so moderate approach, and not extreme, but not so moderate, because, it could be dangerous to get to more than 2 degrees. And actually, when you say also the agreement, I mean, in principle, there is a global agreement. There's been about 30 climate conferences, the COPs, and
Yes.
And one of the latest one in the United Arab Emirates was to reach 30% renewables by 2030. It was tripling renewables by 2030, and making energy use more efficient, as well as many other measures.
Yes.
So, in principle, there are these global targets, and it's taken the global community 30 years to get to this stage. It's a very slow process, I agree, but things are moving, and so it's not quite what you'd say. Nothing's happening because the carbon price is too low. I mean, things are happening because of this consensus. It's just the time it takes for society to move. When there is something. So how can we communicate a possible risk? I'm not saying it's huge risk, but just in a moderate way, how we can communicate to people. There is a real risk that 2 degree warmer, the planet could lead to extreme events that are not so pleasant for us.
Well, there certainly can be extreme events that aren't pleasant. They already exist. So that part, there's no problem. We still have, category 5 hurricanes. Those are nasty. They're incredibly destructive. And it is true that if the temperature warms, we expect to see more of those, because there'll be more energy in the system, as you said. But we don't expect there'll be more hurricanes in general. That's not actually something that the climate model suggests. And the extra damage associated with having slightly higher probability of category 5 storms is actually pretty modest when you actually look at the consequences of it. It's not locally modest. When a category 5 storm hits a city, it's incredibly destructive. But there's so few of them that having just a little bit more of them turns out not to be that much of a global damage. It turns out to be pretty small. So one of the things I think that the problem the climate community is having is they think that somehow or another, that the climate scientists are thinking that just having a warmer temperature itself is enough to convince people not to be terribly scared. If that 3 degrees is going to be an incredibly frightening thing just by itself. But I think what you have to actually show is something that goes beyond that. You have to show that if it is 3 degrees, what will in fact be what are the impacts? How will the world actually be that different? If it turns out that we will definitely have sea level rise, that's one of the things we know is connected to warmer temperatures. We know we're going to see that. But then the question is, well, okay, suppose there is sea level rise. How bad is that? Well, we've had sea level rise for the last 150 years. It's not really been something we've hardly noticed. So it's it's not that sea level rise itself is all that destructive. It's a question of, well, it's going to accelerate a little bit. How bad is that? It turns out we can adapt to a lot of these things. And it's not that it's free, that it doesn't cost us anything. But it turns out there are things that we can actually live with. And if you said, look, we're going to go all into solar radiation, and we're going to create a program that's going to decide exactly what the Earth's temperature is going to be, and we're going to run that program, and it's going to be that temperature, and that's it. I think the world will have a hard time figuring out what that temperature ought to be, because I would be surprised if the people said, "Wow, okay, we can pick anything we want." I'll pick the 1900 temperature. Most of the people in the world probably would not want to have that 1900 temperature. They actually realize that today's temperature is better than that. It's actually better to have the 2000 year temperature than the 1900 temperature. And maybe people would say, well, actually, maybe the 200, maybe +1, maybe 2 degrees is actually perfect. That if we made it a little bit warmer, trees would like that. The crops would do just fine. I wouldn't have to take all my vacations in Italy. I could actually stay in France. I could stay in Great Britain. I've been joking around a little bit, but what I'm trying to get across is that the optimal temperature for the world, it isn't something we've thought much about before. And one of the things that seems to be true, the 2 degrees thing that we came up with, it turns out there's no scientific foundation for that. That was something where people tried to go back and find out where was the science that led to 2 degrees. And apparently it goes all the way back to Professor Nordhaus in 1990, when he said, well, 2 degrees, that seems like a lot. Let's aim for that. It was off the cuff. And we've gotten stuck on 2 degrees. And it turns out that there's nothing magic about 2 degrees. And we could well find that, well, actually 3 degrees is pretty good. It's not that bad. It's not that different from where we are today. It'll be different, but not different in a way that we find all that alarming. That if we lived in a world that's 3 degrees, it actually is quite pleasant. The people that I find most frightened about climate change are the people that live in cold places. The people in England and Norway and Sweden, they can't imagine a world that's 2 degrees warmer. But what's 2 degrees warmer? That's like living in Italy. And Italy's perfect. That's where everybody wants to go. So, part of what I'm having trouble grasping is what, in fact, is the best temperature for the planet. And that question, like if we could just choose any temperature, it's not obvious you'd want to go back to 1900 and say, well, that was it. That for some reason that was the perfect temperature. I would guess that warmer temperatures actually would be preferred, frankly. But that's a question that we need to talk about, and we need to talk about, well, if even if we want the current temperature to stay exactly where it is, how much worse off are we if it turns out we have to endure 2 degree more warming? My feeling is that's actually very acceptable. That actually, when you start to look at what you actually lose, it's not that much. What you should start to be worried about is if we say, well, what about 5 degrees then? Well, at 5 degrees, things start to get much, very different in ways that we really might not like at all. So I think there are temperatures out there that we really want to avoid. I think it's very inexpensive to avoid those high temperatures. It won't take a big sacrifice to keep ourselves, for example, at 3 degrees. They're 2 degrees warmer than today. It would not take a huge sacrifice to do that. And my sense is that might be our sweet spot. That might be if we only start to say, okay, we want 3 degrees, but we're serious now. We're not just going to play around with this. If you're going to hit 3 degrees, we have to be doing some things today globally, and everybody's got to be part of this program. And therefore, we've got to get serious about it to make sure that we don't go above 3 degrees. Because my sense is that's when you start to talk about things where it's a planet that actually is worse. You don't want to go beyond 3.
So the degree of warming, I agree with you, is not something that is established by a scientific doctrine, or it was, like you said, it was just a reference. But and that's what the scientific community is working towards, finding out what happens when we increase the temperature by so much and so on. And but again, that goes back to the increased risks. And particularly the fact that what is not it's not the fact that we want to control the temperature of the planet. It's the fact that it's the humans, like we said at the beginning, is the humans that are causing this increase in temperature. And the fact that we are able to make this change, I think, should be concerning enough. But the other aspect is that if we consider this in the very long term of the cycles of the Earth, hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years, we know that the temperature was even higher than now, considerably higher. But the problem is that it also gets into an unstable state. So, if the temperature can flip from very high down to very low geological times, it's much longer than our lifetimes, but still, we are kind of pushing the temperature towards that kind of tipping point, and we discussed about other tipping points. So again, it's all around risks. How much risk we want to run? We know 2 degrees will have this kind of risk, 3 degrees this kind of risk, but I feel that this is not communicated well enough, because I think there should be more about. The weather can change because of the background temperature
the weather will change. I mean, the weather is just a random draw from the climate. So if the climate gets warmer, you're going to get warmer weather. That's obvious. It's just that you'll still get weather.
But it's not. It's not just that when people perceive 2 degrees, it's not that everything increases by 2 degrees. It's also the weather around it changes the features, so it's not.
Yes.
You could have cold nights that are now minus 10 degrees. It could be minus 5. It's not 1 degree. That can be accentuated, and the same for heat waves. Instead of having being, so it's the whole distribution that can change. But I think we've drifted a bit on the climate science when we were going to talk more about the economics.
But economics, yes. So
just to conclude, I guess we want to wrap up the conversation, which is, I don't want to take more of your time. You've been very generous, and your expertise is an adaptation, and we haven't discussed that much. So maybe I give you the opportunity.
We should talk about some adaptation.
Just briefly, if you can just give us a bit of pointers around adaptation. What are the key aspects? If we can't manage to do mitigation well, we then need to.
How do we adapt? So it turns out that because of interspatial things, our relationship with the sun, we have these long-term Plankovich cycles that have caused the climate change a great deal over the last million years. It's gone through these cycles for 8 of these cycles where it gets super cold, and then it gets warm, and it gets super cold and warm. So the planet has been through climate change. The planet we know today has survived climate change before. And we're on the high end of that cycle. That is, we're in one of these brief periods where it's warm, and then it's going to get cold again. Where the climate, where the planet normally is, it's much colder than today. So right now we're experiencing this brief moment of warmth. One of the questions is, well, how did plants survive this? How did nature survive these things? And one of the things that we have, what scientists have discovered, is nature survived this by moving back and forth between the poles and the equator. So in the super warm periods, they've moved toward the poles, and the plant life has stretched out and has taken most of the planet, most of the land masses, and has life inside most of the land masses. And when it gets colder, it contracts again towards the equator. So that is how the ecosystems have adapted in the past. And in some ways, that's exactly what we need to do when it comes to things like crops. As it gets warmer, we too need to have our crops expand towards the poles. move away from the equator so that individual crops can stay in the climate that they are most comfortable growing in. And it turns out that that kind of adaptation is something that's going on as we speak. You suddenly see in Europe that there's things that used to be peculiar to southern France and Italy. They're now being grown in northern France, and even in England's growing grapes. Oh, good grief. They're getting into the wine business. That was not possible 100 years ago. They couldn't grow grapes there. So what you're seeing, that expansion is a form of adaptation. And what that is one of the reasons why our agricultural system is very likely going to be able to withstand another 2-degree warming, is we will make those kinds of adjustments. Farmers will gradually adjust which crops they grow where. And as they do that, then they're going to adapt to the new climate. So that's an example in agriculture where you can see how the system can adapt. The same thing would happen with forests. Forests have been moving gradually north. The planet as a whole has been greening because of the warming we've been doing. So there's more of the planet is green now than it used to be. So that part of the system looks like it's actually pretty adept at adapting to a warmer world, at least up to 3 degrees. Once you move beyond 5, then bad things start to happen. So I'm not saying that there's no temperature you want to avoid. I'm kind of a happy person to be at 3, and as you move beyond 3, the damages are going to start to accelerate. But those are examples of adaptation. Sea level rise is another important case. And, as the sea rises, what are we going to do about our coastlines? Well, obviously, we're going to shrink them. We're going to move away from the oceans. But how will we do that? It turns out in the places that are sparsely inhabited, the coastlines that are sparsely inhabited, we're going to retreat. We're just going to simply move back from the coast. In cities, we got a lot of cities that are intentionally on the coast. And they're there for a reason. They're there for 2 reasons. One, for a business reason. It turns out that we communicate with each other with products over the oceans. And so the oceans are super important. And so ports are super important. And so we have cities built around ports. So that is something that we have to maintain. We need those ports near the water for them to be functional. And it turns out the adaptations they need to make are a very subtle moving back. So you're talking about having particular lowlands in certain cities, abandoning the lowlands, but then gradually moving into the hills. You're not talking about just moving every one of our port cities 100 miles inland. We're talking about moving them 100 meters inland in order to adapt to sea level rise. And we'll be talking about putting up seawalls where they're needed. And that's something that Europe has been doing for thousands of years. They've built seawalls along the coastlines. That's something that the rest of the world is going to have to adopt as a way of protecting their cities. So that's another example of protection or adaptation. A little bit of moving back from our lowlands, but actually protecting cities, building seawalls and things to make sure that they're not inundated by storms.
But on this point about adaptation through walls and so on due to sea level rise, this would be related to, again, what a 2 degree, 3 degree temperature leads to in terms of sea level rise. So it could be 100 meters, but it could be a few kilometers, depending on how because we know the sea level responds to the temperature quite directly, and the ocean expands.
And that's going to be a gradual process. That's going to be what I would call a dynamic response. It's not a one-time thing. We'll build one seawall and that's it. Then we're done. That's going to be a case where you'll build a seawall that'll last 50 years, and then you'll retreat a little bit and build a seawall behind that that'll last another 50 years, and then you'll build one behind that for another 50 years. So the 100 meters is actually what would happen over 150 years. But what you would see is a series of seawalls, a series of gradually movement further and further back, and that will go on. That's not a one-time solution. We're done with it. That's something that'll be a dynamic solution that will make constant changes.
Then the question is, what is the cost of building so many seawalls compared
Yes.
to mitigation? And so
And it turns out
that
it's cheaper. That's the point. That's the reason why you do adaptation, because it's cheaper. And it's not because you wouldn't do mitigation. This is all actually, when we've agreed to go to 3 degrees, we've agreed to a lot of climate change. And so now it turns out we also have to agree how to live with that. And so the adaptation is, okay, I've decided 3 degrees is good, but part of the reason I've decided 3 degrees is good is because I'm going to do this adaptation so that I don't get drowned by failing to build that first seawall. I don't have all this destruction that happens through every city on the coast. I've actually gradually started to protect myself to reduce the damages that you're actually going to see. It's not that you do adaptation or you do mitigation. You've got to do them both. You've got to do mitigation to give yourself a limit to how far this is going to go. But then you've agreed to do some climate change, so you've got to adapt to that as well. These both have to happen. And one of the things,
because they actually the two are related. It's not one or the other, because if you don't invest in mitigation, the cost for adaptation increases quite a lot because you get higher sea level. So you need to really strike a good balance there. I'm not up to date with the cost for adaptations versus mitigation. But to me, if you build seawalls all around the globe, because many cities are near the coast, it's not particularly going to be cheap overall compared to mitigation.
But it's cheaper than letting your cities get inundated.
Of course.
Yes.
Of course.
Europe already has seawalls, so you already are protected. You already depend on them. But the United States, for example, does not.
But if you could try to avoid some
a huge amount of damage. Yes. So, and it turns out that with sea level rise, the intelligence of building seawalls increases. That is, it gets ever more effective to have seawalls if you've got sea level rise. Because the damages you avoid with the seawall are much greater than the cost of the seawall. That's why you do it. And if that's not true, you shouldn't build a seawall. If you're building seawalls that you're not getting any benefits, you shouldn't build them. But that's why I'm talking about building the seawalls in cities, but maybe not in rural areas, retreating in rural areas.
And just to conclude again, they just like have your quick take on. You give a very good overview of what happens when the temperature of the planet changes and how nature adapts through crops, through forests, and so on. But that's a natural system, and that's fine. We can move it. It's what about the humans? It's much more expensive.
We should be. We're a little bit more agile than the natural system. We have no excuse. We can make these changes very quickly, and we can help nature make them even faster than it would all by itself.
But that could be also migration, which is not welcome in some parts of the world.
Well,
so
it does mean change. Yes, and some people don't like change. So Europe, for example, they have traditional crops that are grown in traditional places. I've just talked about crops moving. Well, that's going to create havoc with that idea, because all of a sudden what you grew there 10 years ago may not be the best thing to grow 50 years from now. It might be there's a different crop that's best to grow there. So that some of the things culturally that we're attached to and that we don't want to let go of, you can hold on to them for dear life, but it turns out it's going to be very expensive not to adapt. Then that's where you're going to see a lot of pain. If people say, no, my grandfather grew this crop, I have to grow it. That's going to be painful because that crop might not do well anymore. And all the neighbors around you might be doing really great with something new. And you insist, no, I'm going to grow what my grandfather grew. If it turns out people are not willing to make changes, then it's going to be painful. But the beauty about adaptation is that it's in the incentive for the individual to make the change. This doesn't have to be planned in Brussels, that every province can make a different plan for itself. Every local area can make different plans that are best for itself. And that's the thing that's beautiful about adaptation. It's very different from mitigation. Mitigation has to be centrally planned. The globe has to plan this. Otherwise, it isn't going to work. But adaptation doesn't have to be that. Adaptation is best done locally. It's best done knowing what you yourself are facing and the new climate, what's best for you. And the adaptations are actually in your interest to do. The incentive is that you'll be happier living in a new climate if you wear the right clothes, if you do your exercise at the right time of the day, if you grow the right crops, if you want to have a vegetable garden outside your house, you grow something that actually will grow. I mean, all these things, it makes sense to adapt because you'll be a lot happier, prospering in the new climate than being woeful that somehow the climate's different and I can't do what my grandfather did. I think that the beauty of adaptation is there's a built-in incentive to do it. And so there's every reason the world will adapt because everybody has an incentive to adapt themselves. They don't need to be told. They might need to be given some advice about what kinds of things will work. But once you give them that advice, if it works, they don't need to be told a second time. They'll say thank you, and then they'll move on and make that change.
I think, we could go on for a long
but
time.
This is why I'm excited about adaptation.
Yes,
I think it's been underestimated.
We should wrap up, but maybe we can find another opportunity to talk again because, I still have many questions around, the mitigation and adaptation. The two are not unrelated, and sometimes actually I don't want to start another line of thought, but sometimes you pay for adaptation because you haven't done enough mitigation, and then you end up, spending on both sides because,
they're definitely related in that way. Absolutely, they're tied together. And yes. It used to be people when I first started to talk about adaptation, I was considered to be one of these anti-climate people because all they were talking about is mitigation. And if it turns out you can adapt, then the damages from mitigation aren't as big as they said. And then it turns out, well, you don't really want to do that. Then you don't want to spend that much money on mitigation if it turns out you can adapt. And so they were mad about it. That somehow their mitigation goal was being upset. But ideally, you want to do these things together. This is an integrated plan, and it's a complicated plan because it's got to be global and it's dynamic. It's moving all the time globally. But this is the goal. This is the goal: is to try to do them together.
So this is a very good place to stop, Robert. That's been extremely interesting to speak with you and. Trying to understand some of these big issues around climate change, economics, and indeed the physical system. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we can have you again on the show to continue the discussion.
I'd be delighted to join you again. This is fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to explore our other interviews and subscribe to our channel to receive notifications about future episodes.